Welcome to this video. This time we will talk about form validation with JavaScript. For that, we will work on this form right here. At the moment, we don't have any inputs and we have this grayed out button down here. And if I click onto it, well, nothing is happening. But we want to add code, JavaScript code, which allows us to achieve the following. If I enter a value, any kind of value, into this name field, could be a single letter or my name, Manuel for example, and an email, a valid email, we will talk about what is valid throughout this video. So let's say test@test.com maybe. And then a message, so again, just a single letter or a word. So if I enter an H for hello, for example, then you can see that the submit button down here immediately changes its color. If I would, for example, delete the name right here, it would be gray again. So let's add another letter. And if I would delete the @ for example, from the email, it would also be gray. And the same thing would be true if I delete the dot, for example. Now, that's the one thing. We want to make sure that the button changes the color once we have valid inputs for our fields. But in addition to that, if we then click this activated button, then I want to log out submitted right here to our console. This means we will prevent the default behavior. The default behavior of a form would be to send a request, a GET or POST request to a server. So we also want to prevent this default behavior and console log submitted right here. That's it. Let's see how we can do this now. Now this video is about the form validation in JavaScript. But what if you never heard about forms before? Well, a form generally is something like that. It's a page that allows a user to enter information, but to also submit this information to a server. This works with a request, a GET or POST request, by the way. Now, in case you never heard about these concepts before, make sure to have a look at 2 articles. You can find a link to the articles in the video description, by the way. The first article is this one right here. It's this Your First HTML Form article on the MDN. If you have a look at this article, you will find out all the core concepts we have when it comes to creating forms in HTML. Also very important, you will also find out more about the form element right here, the special element we use to create such a form, and about the elements inside this form, the so-called widgets, for example, this input or this text area element right here. So definitely make sure to check out that to understand the general concept of a form. In addition to that, also make sure to read through this article, Sending Form Data. As I said, this will talk about the submit event, so this event that happens once we click onto this button, and also about this GET and POST request, because the information will be sent to a server. Now with these things clarified, let's now think about form validation in JavaScript. Now with these things clarified, let's now go back to our page and add the form validation with JavaScript. For that we have 2 goals. The first goal is, as we saw it in the intro, to make sure that the button changes the color once all our inputs are valid. And the second goal is to make sure that this button is clickable and that we also output this submitted text to our console. Let's focus onto this changing background color thing first. Because for that, we need access to these 2 fields, this text area and the button. And then we have to tell our code basically when the inputs into these fields are valid and that the button should change the background color. So basically, our button needs to be able to understand what happens to our fields right here. For that, let's go back to our code and let's have a quick look at the HTML code. This is our form right here. And as we can see, the first input right here has the ID input name. Then we have the second input, this mail input with the ID input mail. The third one, our message, has the input message ID. And then we have our button with the submit button class right here. So let's first get access to all these elements. For that, we go to the main.js file. And now we simply apply concepts we know from the previous videos in the series. So we declare a variable, which we could call input name, for example. And let's now add document get element by ID. So we will use the ID selector this time. And I forgot the ID, to be honest. It's input name. So let's add input name right here. And now we can simply copy this 2 times, or actually 3 times. And now change name to male, like that. And also input male, right? Because that's what we want to access right here. And then we have the third one, which is message. This should also be input message right here. And for the last variable, we want to access our button. So let's maybe name the variable button. And I will use the query selector right here, like that. And now we will access the submit button class right here, this one. So let's add it right there. And don't forget to add the dot to make sure the class is selected correctly. So now we can select all these elements, and now we have to define a function. And in this function, we simply want to check if our fields have a value as an input. And if the fields have a value, then the background color of our button should change. Now let's do this step by step, and let's start by creating our function. And this function could be called check input, maybe, as you prefer. And inside this function, we now need to check if the inputs are valid, as I said. For that, a so-called if statement definitely is not the worst idea. So let's add it. Let's say if. And now we need to specify a condition. So what should happen to our inputs to make sure that this if condition is true? Well, actually, it's quite easy. We simply have to say that our input name, this object right here, so basically our field. Well, this fields, so input name, this fields, now we need to access a specific property because this field's value, right? Because that's what's interesting. If this field contains a special value, then this if condition is true. And actually, we do not have to specify a special value because we could just think about it the other way around. Because we could either check if this field contains any value or any specific value, or we could just say that if the value of this field is not equal, so this right here, this comparison operator exactly checks that, so is not equal to what? To empty. Because if it would be empty, then it would not be true. But as soon as we enter any value into this field, this should become true. That's maybe not the perfect solution for that, but I think it's a really nice approach to understand the basic concept behind this validation logic right here. So with that, we said that if our input value is not equal to empty, then this is true. That's the first case. So what should happen if this is true? Well, then we want to access our button. And what do we want to access? We also learned that throughout the series. We want to access the style property. Specifically this time, we want to access the background color. And whenever this condition is true, then the background color of our button should change to, let's say, FA923F, like that. So that's the first condition. So if this condition is true, then this should happen. But what if this is not true? So if we don't have any value in our field, well, then we have to say else. Well, else, it's pretty easy, right? We simply have to add button, style, background color once again. And now we could set it equal to the default color, so to this gray right here. And this can be found in the style CSS sheet right here in the submit button selector. So this code right here, including the hash. And we can simply paste it right here. Don't forget to add the semicolon. And with that, we actually defined that function already. We only defined it for the first input field, input name though, but the general concept is finished. The only problem we have though is that, well, this function doesn't get called at the moment. So we didn't tell our code when it should execute this function. The good thing is that we have a really nice approach that we can use right here, which allows us to execute or access this function whenever we add any kind of input into our name field. This can be added by simply going to the HTML file. And now we go to our input right here, the second one with the ID input name. And now we simply add the onInput attribute right here. This attribute, well, as the name actually indicates, simply reacts to any kind of input that we have for our input field right here. So in easy words, whenever we type anything into this field. So this onInput can react to these values we enter. And how does it react? Well, it reacts by calling a specific function. And as we already defined a function, this one right here, our checkInput function, I think it might be a good idea to simply add this checkInput function right now for this onInput attribute. So checkInput, important. Also add the parenthesis because we really want to call this function. We don't want to point to this function, we want to call and therefore execute it. Really important to add this right here. But with that, we actually have a nice structure, right? We made sure that we have a way to kind of listen to events, so to this input event right here, whenever we type anything. And once we enter a value, we will execute this function right here, which hopefully then changes the background color of our button. Let's see if we reload the page, if this works. So if I enter A, for example, right here, yeah. As you can see, once I enter a value, the background color of the button immediately changes. This also works if I enter multiple values, of course, it stays orange. But once I delete the values, the button gets gray again. We do have one issue though, because if I just enter a space now, the button color also changes. That's probably not what we want at the moment, because we only want to change our button's color if we enter any value, but not a space. So any value different from a space, a white space, basically. The good thing is that we can easily trim our function with a method that's, well, actually called like that, the trim method. So if we go back to the code and now simply add after the value property this trim method like that, including the parentheses again, like that, well, then the value will be trimmed. This means any white space to the left or to the right of our string will be deleted, basically. Now, what does this mean? If we save that and go back, then if I would add a space now, the button color doesn't change. But if I type space hello, it will change again. So that's basically how you can easily get rid of such white spaces to the left and to the right of your strings. So that was the first step. We made sure that the name field now is a field that our button recognizes and that it can react to. But we also have the mail and the message field. Let's quickly add the message field first because the logic is exactly the same, and then have a look at the mail. Because for the mail, I want to make a more specific, a more tailored check to see if the mail is really valid. Now let's work on the message, and as I said, this is quite simple actually, because it's basically the same code right here. The only thing we have to change is we have to change input name to input message. So we can simply take this part right here, like that, and now add a space and copy it right here. Now we change name to message, right? Because this is the variable name we have right here. And now this won't work because we have to add a specific operator, a so-called logical operator to our code. Because what we want to tell our if statement right here is that it should check if this condition right here is true, the first one, and that's the important thing, and the second condition should also be checked, and we should see if this is true or not. And as I said, the logical operator we need for that is the AND logical operator, and we simply add it by typing AND, this AND symbol, 2 times. And now the if statement will check if the first condition right here and this second condition, if both are true, and if that's the case, then this code right here will be executed. However, we can save this, but we also have to add our onInput attribute to the message, of course, because otherwise the event that we type a value into our message field cannot be recognized by our JavaScript code. So let's simply copy this code right here and add it down here after our input message ID right there, for example. With that, if we go back, reload the page and type A right here, we get an error, cannot read property. Let's see. Yeah, I got a typo right here. This should of course be written with a small m, not a capital M. Sorry for that, but with saving that and reloading the page, this should work perfectly now. So let's see if I type A right here and also any kind of value for the message. Then you see that our submit button changes its color. If I delete this right here, it turns gray again. If I add this one, it gets orange. And if I delete this one, it also turns back to gray. So this validation is also working now. So we have the name and the message validated. The only problem now is the mail, because as I said, I want to make sure that we have a more specific validation method for that. And I will use RegEx for this purpose. RegEx stands for regular expressions, and these RegEx simply allow us to check if our code meets certain or specific patterns. In case you never heard about these, make sure to have a look at this series right here, because in there, Max gives you a really cool introduction into RegEx, so therefore make sure to check this out in case you're not sure about how RegEx generally work. However, we want to add a RegEx now for our mail validation. This means we first have to add another variable up here. I will call this variable, well, maybe RegEx. And now we will simply add 2 slashes like that. And in between these slashes, I will now paste a regular expression. You can find the regular expression in the video description, by the way. So let me paste that right here and add the semicolon. And without diving into the details behind this rather simple regular expression, this simply checks if we have a value different from a white space right here. Then an @ symbol, which makes sense for an email, I guess. Then it checks again if we have a value different from a white space. Then if we have a dot, and then it checks for another value different from a white space. Of course, this will not check for any kind of email combination that we can imagine, but that's not the idea of this video. You can of course add any regular expression of your choice right here. The important thing is that you understand the logic, how you can do this. So we have our regex up here, but now we need to include it as a condition in our if statement. How can we do this? Well, first we will add another logical operator, the AND operator, because I want to have the check for the email as the second condition, just to follow along the flow in our form right here. And now we can use a special regex syntax, which simply works like that. We add regex, so our variable right here that we defined. And now we add the test method right here. Don't forget to add the parentheses right here. Because inside the parentheses, we now simply have to specify what should be tested against this regex right here. Well, and in our case, this is of course our input mail, because if we paste it right here, and now specified that for input mail, a specific property should be tested against this parentheses. And which property could that be? Well, the value property once again. That's actually exactly the same logic we had for our input name and for our input message, but now we're just testing this value against this regular expression. With that, we can now make sure that we have a better email validation implemented, but we also have to make sure that we add our own input attribute right here also to our second input, this one right here, for our email. So let's add this quickly right here, like that. Well, and if we now did a good job, then if we reload the page and enter a value right here, a valid email, which could be something like test@test.com, and another value for the message, then our submit button changed its color. That's pretty good. If I get rid of that right here, it turns gray again. That's what we saw already. But if I now delete the dot, for example, you can see that the button turns back to gray, so it's invalid again. And if I get rid of the @ for example, same thing happens. And the same thing should be true if I delete the values in front of the @ symbol, for example. So this works quite nice actually. By the way, in case you wonder why we didn't have something like equals true or something like that right here to our regex test, well, this is simply due to the fact that if we write the code like this inside our if statement, the result will automatically be true or false. And if the result of this test is true, then our if condition will be met. That's just a side note. However, we have this nice color for the button and now it's orange. But if I click onto it, well, still nothing is happening. And this is due to the fact that at the moment we have here for our button down there, the disabled attribute added. And because of that, the button is, well, as the name indicates, disabled. Therefore, we cannot click it. Now, in the first step, I want to make this button clickable again. For that, we can use the JavaScript logic we added so far and simply add the button with the disabled attribute now. Now, at the moment, the disabled attribute is true. It is activated, you could say, and therefore we cannot click the button. But if I now change disabled to false, right here like that, without any quotation marks, because we don't want to have a string right here. This should be a boolean, a so-called boolean, so we could have true or false in that case. Here we need false because if the condition is met, so if the button changes our background color, it should also be clickable, therefore disabled should be set to false. Now, we should also add the button right here for our else case. So if the conditions are not met, then our button should of course be disabled. Therefore, we set it right here to true. So if we now go back, reload the page, add some valid values right here, like that. And now, well, before I submit the button, let me show you right here my address bar up here. And please note that right now the URL ends with HTML. That's important because if we now click onto submit, this hopefully changes. Let's see. Well, first we saw that the zoom changed. Let's make it like that again. Well, now you can see some interesting things. The first thing is that the form was cleared again because the form was now submitted. But more interestingly, we can also see that now after HTML, right here, we have the actual content of our form added to our URL. Here we have the name, which was equal to A. We have our email with test@test.com. And we have the message, which was equal to A. Not the most creative content though, but still, we can see that this was added to our URL. Now, I won't dive into the details behind what was happening right here now. As I said, make sure to check out the MDN article, this one right here, sending form data, in case this is totally new for you. The only important thing I want to focus on right now is that with the button being enabled again, we are able to fire a submit event. And as I didn't add any kind of attributes right here to our form, normally you would add 2 attributes at least. You would add the action attribute, which would define where this form should be submitted to. And you would also define a method, a get or post would be the values for that. And in my case right here, I didn't specify any of these attributes. Therefore, the method is get. And the action, so where this form will be submitted to, is the current page in our browser. Therefore, it's this page right here, and we add the content right here because, well, it's a GET request. As I said, I won't dive too deep into this right now. The important thing is that basically our submit button is working now, but there might be cases where you might say, well, I don't want this request, this GET request in our case, to happen immediately. This means I want to prevent the default behavior after the submit event right here was fired. Now, the good thing is that with JavaScript, we can also easily do that. The only thing we need for that is access to the actual form element. Now, let's quickly get this access by going back to the code right here and now adding a variable named form. And this should simply give us the access, as I said, to our form, we will access the form with a class selector, and the class is, well, form, so it's quite easy. So let's select the form class right here. And now, maybe down here, we can add an event listener to this class. So we will simply type form, add event listener, also something we learned about in the previous parts of the series, by the way. And now we will add submit as the event this event listener should listen to, because that's what happens. If we click onto the submit button, a submit event will occur. Now with this event, we also have to define a function, and we will define a special function for that. Because whenever an event occurs in JavaScript, a default event object is generated. Now again, I won't dive into the details behind that, but the important thing is that we can listen to this event and we can actually access this event. Now how can we do this? Well, we first have to add a parameter to this event. This parameter could have any name you want. I will just name it event right now. And now I want to do two things. First, I want to make sure that this default event that happens after clicking onto the submit button is prevented. And what is this event? Well, we click onto the submit button, and with that, the request will be sent to a server. And I want to prevent this request. I don't want this to happen. For that, I simply type event now, like that, because that's right here, our default event object, basically. And now we type prevent default, including the parentheses right here. In addition to that, I will add a console log, like that, and log, well, the event to see what's actually happening right here. If I now go back and reload our page, or maybe even quickly jump to the home page and go back to the contact page to make sure that the URL doesn't include our content of the form that we added right here. And if I now add a name, a valid email, and a message, well, if I now hit submit once again, then you can see two interesting things. You can see that the URL ends still with HTML, so we didn't add the actual content of our form right here, as we did it before, and therefore the GET request wasn't sent to the server because, well, we prevent this default behavior with this method right here. And we also logged the actual event, and if we click right here, you can, for example, see that the default behavior indeed was prevented. So let me quickly summarize that. We made sure that once we click onto the submit button, the submit event is fired, but the default event, which would send a request to a server, is not occurring right now. What we could do right now is we could also add something like console log, maybe submitted, like that, to kind of display our own message right here. So if we reload, add test at test.com, like that, and now press submit. Now you can see that we print submitted to our console. And now the question is, why would I want to prevent this default event from happening? Well, there could be various reasons. One reason could be, for example, that you want to further process the information your user would send you through this form. You could add some additional information to it, for example. And by controlling the actual request, so by controlling the fact when it should be submitted, you can easily do that, and by that gain additional, well, form control. And that's it actually. That was a very basic example how you could implement form validation with JavaScript. Now, of course, there are multiple ways how to implement form validation in your code. You could also do it on the server side, for example. But the purpose of this video really was to get you started with JavaScript, to let you dive deeper a bit and to get an understanding how you can apply all these different theoretical concepts like the if condition we had, like event listeners, or also like the prevent default method, the trim method, and more. And with that, I can only say, well, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in one of the next videos of this series. Bye.